Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
In the Heights, a brand new adaptation of the Broadway smash, is now playing in theaters and streaming on HBO Max. In honor of its release, we're looking at the state of the modern musical. How is one of Hollywood's most beloved genres adapted to the changing times? And are there any great films in this new era of song and dance? We'll discuss that and more with help from a special guest on this musical-centric new episode of the show.
Welcome to Film Club.
Okay, folks, welcome again to a new episode of Film Club. Thank you for joining us for it. The weather is nice again. It's June, with more and more people being vaccinated. People are getting out in the streets again, and maybe seeing some new movies. Katie, you seen anything in the theater lately?
Well, I went and saw In the Heights, which was, a good big screen spectacle. But right now I'm hiding in the air conditioning. I'm not enjoying the weather at all.
Yeah, air conditioning is sort of the that's one of the bonuses of going to the movies in the summer. Is that you escape the heat for a little bit.
Oh yeah, we didn't have air conditioning when I was a kid, and so in the summertime we would just go and hang out at the movie theater all day. Sometimes.
We didn't have it either. I think we were a fan family. But there's just only so much a fan can do.
Truly.
I remember for a long time, I feel like growing up, I had a very, I don't need an air conditioner. I've been living my whole life with a fan. Mm-hmm. I don't need that extra mechanized
I'm
cool.
Strong.
Yeah, exactly. And then I got one and I was like, what was I doing all those years? So you mentioned In the Heights, which is now, as of this podcast being out, is now in theaters, and it's also available on HBO Max for those who do not yet feel comfortable going to the movies. So we are going to talk today about musicals. And specifically about where the genre is at now and the sort of state of the modern musical. Katie, you have seen the film, so I think we're going to talk a little bit about that, and if you can give maybe some quick impressions to our listeners. But before we do that, I would like to introduce our very special guest. She is a regular contributor to the AV Club, and her name is Caroline Siede. Caroline, how you doing?
I'm doing great. It pained me not to be able to make a June is busting out all over joke during your intro, but here I am to deliver the carousel references.
Yeah, you made it now anyway. It was a little... So, Caroline, you write a regular column for the AV Club that you've been doing for, probably 4 years now, I think?
Yes, I think 3 or 4. It's about romantic comedies, but I have been sneakily putting as many musicals in there as I could, and I really feel like this podcast is a payoff for... that slow burn heist I've been pulling.
You're a big musical fan as well, which is why we thought of you for the show, obviously. And there is plenty of overlap between those two genres over the history of the medium.
Yeah, I mean, when you write a romantic comedy column long enough, you can get in the mindset of arguing that anything is a romantic comedy, but including many superhero films. But I do think that musicals often go hand in hand with romances.
Yeah, they both kind of have that effervescent quality to them.
Also very star-driven a lot of the time as well, We should say that for the listeners who don't know, the column's name is When Romance Met Comedy. It runs every other Friday on the site. I believe this week there is not one running, but you can catch up next week with the column as well, and again with roughly 4 years of them at this point. Caroline, you also have a podcast of your own, is that right?
I do, yeah. It's a new podcast called Roll Calling. Me and one of my friends, we take actors that we love and we sort of do a little 5-film retrospective of their career. So we have covered Christian Bale so far, and we're actually in the middle of an Emily Blunt retrospective, including Mary Poppins Returns. So that's a sort of little musical connection here as well. Nice.
What are the other films that you're covering for Blunt?
Yeah, we did The Devil Wears Prada, Sicario. We're going to do Edge of Tomorrow, and then we did a little Quiet Place double feature.
Nice.
So,
Katie, you have seen In the Heights at this point. Neither Caroline or I have seen it. I'm bummed. I'm really, really excited to check this one out. But hope to be able to see it soon. If not in a theater, then certainly on HBO Max. Can you just, we're not going to do a full review episode or anything, but can you just give us some quick impressions of what you thought of the film?
Sure. I'm going to lay it all out on the table up front in this episode. I'm sure we'll talk more about it more, but musicals have never really been my bag. They're just not really, for me, like my particular tastes don't tend to go. They're always a little bit too cheerful for me. And so I've never seen Hamilton. I've managed to avoid even listening to anything from Hamilton. Like, no shade if you like Hamilton, but it's just not anything that really appeals to me all that much. So I was a little nervous to go see In the Heights, actually, because I was like, well, what if I'm the one sourpuss who doesn't like it? And I'm pleased to report that I did actually like it. I kind of think that Lin-Manuel Miranda, he kind of can't help but be a little bit corny. There's some kind of corny elements to the movie. Some of the the romance and the jokes are a little bit they're so earnest that it's a little bit nerdy. But, like, that's okay. There are way worse qualities that a person could have than being prone towards corniness. And I think that this musical I liked quite a bit for a couple of reasons. One, it really had a good handle on the spectacle of the whole thing. There is a sequence set at a city pool, which does some nice Busby Berkeley style, water choreography that was really cool. And another thing that I liked about it was it added a lot of the kind of Latin music to the musical form, which I think helped me a lot in terms of appreciating the music. It's set in Washington Heights in New York, and the characters in the film are mostly Latinx, Caribbean, Puerto Rican, Mexican, Dominican, Cuban, and you get a lot of that kind of flavor in it, which I think, it really helped me the music was just really infectious that way. And you add those two elements of spectacle and energy together, and even the sourpuss couldn't help but enjoy In the Heights.
Did you like it enough that you would consider checking out Hamilton now?
Hamilton's a little tough. Rapping about history is a little tough for me.
That's just a bridge too far for you.
It's a little tough, no shade, but I'm just going to go watch. I'm going to spend my time in useful ways, like watching Child's Play 9.
I have not seen In the Heights either on stage or the new movie yet, obviously. I have seen Hamilton on stage and kind of loved it, actually. And
that's what I hear.
I kind of went into it with my own skepticism about it, because the idea of rapping about the founding fathers, it kind of sounds like a joke on The Simpsons or something. And I think even hearing the songs out of context doesn't necessarily do the show that many favors. I think seeing the whole production come together and just sort of, I think being seated in a theater and accepting the reality of the production and what they're doing, I think is sort of seems crucial to me to buying into it in a way.
Sure, I could see that. So don't listen to one song and then be like, oh my God, what is this? And put it away. Sit down and actually watch the musical is what you're saying.
Yeah, honestly, yes.
Okay.
And it is actually available for those who don't want to buy a ticket to see that. I don't know why I'm plugging Hamilton, one of the most...
It's a little
immensely
underseen.
popular.
Yeah, it's a very underseen show, exactly.
Boy, I'll tell you what, for a year, I had to actively try to not hear songs from Hamilton. It was a deliberate choice that I made in my life.
I'm impressed because I think that they even released some radio singles of some of the songs.
They
were
did.
really out there.
It was constant. Yeah, every single day there was something about Hamilton coming up for almost a year. Yeah.
It was really hard to see also for a while, honestly.
That's true.
Number one, you had to live in a major city that was where it was being put on, obviously. But beyond that, even if you did live in Chicago or New York or London, I think it's in London now at this point, right? Even if you did live in those places, ticket sales were, the tickets were often going for really high rates, and it was a very in-demand show. So the fact that it is out there, for those who are still curious about Hamilton and have not watched it, you can watch I'm told a very good recording of the show that is available on Disney+. So it is available. Caroline, what are your thoughts on Hamilton?
Love Hamilton, love In the Heights as well. I'm a big, you hit the nail on the head, Katie, that I think Lin-Manuel Miranda might be the corniest human being who's ever lived. But to me, that's sort of part of the charm of his persona.
Yeah, like I said, there are much worse alternatives.
Yes. I was a big fan of In the Heights when it came out. So I actually have an interesting thing I think maybe that people that are not into musicals don't know is I will often consider a musical one of my favorite musicals, even if I've never seen it. And my experience of it is almost fully from the cast recording, usually reading the plot on Wikipedia, watching, performances at the Tonys or at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, things like that. So that In the Heights falls into that category for me, where I've never seen a production of it, but would consider it one of my favorite shows. So that's sort of an interesting relationship I think people can have with musicals. If, as you're talking about, Alex, if you couldn't go see Hamilton live, I think a lot of people experience that, like, first and foremost, just through the cast recording.
A big time. I mean, I remember even growing up with some musicals that my family would listen to. We would have recordings of certain things. West Side Story was a big one in my household, honestly. And eventually, of course, I did see the movie as well. But I remember we had the soundtrack to West Side Story before I had seen the movie. So I knew a lot of those songs before I ever saw the film, and certainly before I saw it on stage. I finally saw it on stage a couple years ago. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that you can fall in love with a musical without having seen it, just because it sort of crosses these two mediums in a way,
I will say that when I was a kid, we had Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. We had the soundtrack, and I used to listen to that all the time. And I did go see Phantom of the Opera for my 10th birthday. I loved Phantom when I was like 10.
There's got a little darkness in there. I could see how that would be some crossover appeal.
That is kind of the Katie Rife musical in a way. I could see you liking Sweeney Todd too.
I
right?
was going to say Sweeney Todd too. Yeah.
Okay, I'll give it a go.
Caroline, did you grow up with musicals?
Oh yeah, absolutely. My mom was a big musical fan, although I think I quickly took the baton of the musical obsessive in my family. A lot of that was from the Disney Renaissance animated movies like Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast. I was the right age for those to just entirely hit me and sort of dominate my childhood, media diet. So that was a huge like gateway drug for me. And then a combination of, seeing musicals live, loving that, and also we were a family that would just often have TCM playing in the background and, catch whatever Gene Kelly or Judy Garland movie was playing. And then, I mean, I should admit right here, like, I went to theater school. I'm I was the president of my thespian club in high school. Like, you will not get more of a theater kid than me. So I'm certainly coming from that very, particular background where loving musicals is common, which I know is not how the rest of the world necessarily feels about them.
Well, I know quite a few people who are into musicals. Maybe this is something we can discuss, but maybe it's just like as I'm getting older, as you get older, people try less hard to be like cool, and musicals have this reputation for not being like Broadway, not being the coolest thing in the world. And as people get older, they're like, yeah, actually, I'm really into Stephen Sondheim. But I feel like I know a lot of people who are into musicals.
There certainly is a wide variety of them. Like, it is kind of fun. I mean, not that I'm trying to force you to like musicals, Katie, but it is fun to think about, okay, what are the weirder musicals I know of? Like, there's a musical called Bat Boy that's about a tabloid story about a half man, half bat, very demented. Like, there's some weird
like the Weekly World News
out there. Yes, exactly. It's literally based on that. So it ranges from, the genre sort of ranges from like the corny Oklahoma to the demented sort of Sweeney Todd Bat Boy world. So there is something, maybe there's something for everyone in the musical genre if people want to take that journey.
Yeah, I really like the classic Hollywood musicals from like the 30s and 40s. I always enjoyed those.
Oh, so you're a fan. You are a fan of the traditional Hollywood musical, is what you're saying?
Yeah. It's more Broadway that isn't really my bag.
And that is an important distinction. Although, I mean, obviously, some of the classic Hollywood musicals were adaptations of Broadway shows, but not all of them were. And certainly, there is a distinction between what was Broadway fare in, say, the 1930s, and what passes for Broadway fare today.
Yes, I think that Broadway, in the way that film has evolved so much over the years, I think that Broadway has certainly evolved just as much. Where you started with a lot of sort of shows that were really just reviews, like very vaudeville inspired. And then you get Rodgers and Hammerstein, who are sort of introducing more of a narrative book musical, like your Oklahomas and your South Pacifics and your Carousels. And, in the 1970s, you have a lot of these like abstract concept musicals, like the Stephen Sondheim, Company or A Chorus Line, and then into sort of the blockbuster stuff of the 1980s, like Cats and your favorite Phantom of the Opera, Katie. And then, into today, I think the latest trend is sort of a lot of these, and maybe this is actually inspired by film itself, but a lot of these sort of like biopic musicals, like a Jersey Boys, or there's one about Tina Turner and Cher and The Temptations, and that's sort of become one of the latest Broadway trends. It's a very tourist-friendly trend.
Yeah.
In that.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of films being made into musicals over these past 20 years. It seems like that's kind of the direction they've been moving in. Successfully, you had Hairspray, which was adapted into a musical. And then there was Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, which didn't play for very long. But
I would love to see that. Can I say? I would love to see that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a correlation, too, between Hollywood's increasing interest in taking sort of any available IP and milking it and exhausting it to the extent that it can, and Broadway's constant reaching for some new property that it can develop into a big show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of panic in the theater industry basically just about the industry dying. It is a sort of a niche and very expensive thing to attend. And so I think a lot of Broadway shows are like you were saying, they're like, okay, well, Pretty Woman, that's a popular movie. Let's turn that into a musical. And sometimes there are good examples of that. I think Hairspray is a great example of that. But a lot of times there are pretty so-so examples of that.
I do think it's interesting to look at the respective histories of Broadway and of Hollywood, and to look at their histories over the last century or so, because honestly, I feel like musicals have remained a dominant form of popular entertainment on the stage for this entire time. People still go out in droves to see musicals, and they have certainly for as long as cinema has been competing with the stage. But I feel like the movie industry, the popularity of musicals has obviously waxed and waned over the years. They were popular from pretty much the invention of sound film. I mean, if you look at The Jazz Singer in 1927, sort of widely considered to be the first feature-length sound film, and largely sort of looked at as the death knell of the silent era, that was essentially a musical. And they were huge from basically the 30s until the late 60s. I mean, you had a whole studio system built around talent who were sort of catering their gifts to the art of song and dance. You had directors like Vincent Minnelli who built a career on directing musicals. Musicals also were a big part of the history of the Academy Awards. I mean, many have won Best Picture in the 60s during the sort of tail end of Hollywood's classic musical period. Several took home the top prize, including Oliver in 1968, which was the last musical to win Best Picture until the early 2000s. The genre sort of began to taper off in the late 60s. I mean, I think you saw a number of very high-profile failures at that time. These sort of large. It was like this bubble had grown and then it burst at the end of the 60s. I'm going to ask you first, Caroline. Why do you think that musicals passed out of fashion for a while in Hollywood?
It's an interesting question. I think part of it is that there are these waves that do just burst. Like, I think the past decade has been people wondering when that's going to happen with superhero movies, which I think are almost like an equivalent trend of, you kind of feel like, okay, this can't last forever. And I think with musicals in particular, it was sort of a lack of ability to evolve, at least in movie musicals. You look at something like Hello, Dolly, which is this big, super old-fashioned, super corny movie musical that comes out 2 years after Bonnie and Clyde kind of, right, revolutionizes cinema. And so that just feels so out of step with what is sort of where the culture is. We've kind of been hitting on the fact that musicals they're very uncool, right? They're very corny. They're very kind of ridiculous. And I feel like in the late 60s and 70s, people kind of, there was an interest in being cool and dark. And I actually think Broadway did a good job of evolving in that sense. I think Broadway sort of had its own equivalent, I don't know, New Hollywood thing with these darker concept musicals, but I think Hollywood was not able to adapt that. You look at something like Hair, which was very revolutionary on stage, but doesn't get adapted into a film until a decade later. And so by then, that already feels out of fashion as well. And I think, an exception that kind of proves the rule is something like Cabaret, Bob Fosse's version from, I think, 1972 maybe. And that's a movie that I think was a very successful musical in this sort of period when musicals weren't as popular. And I think that was specifically because it was darker and it felt different and it felt more in line with sort of where culture was than something like Hello, Dolly did.
And sexier too, because also something that I'm thinking of from this period, something that was a stage play that became a very successful film, is the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Which also has that sort of darker cult classic quality to it, very counterculture, which I think musicals, big Broadway, the big, image of a big Broadway musical is certainly not counterculture. And then I think the more counterculture musicals, like something like Company, which is basically just like a man having an existential crisis on stage, like that is more difficult to adapt for a film. It maybe takes more creativity than Hollywood was used to when they had this big machine of here's how you churn out, the MGM musical. And maybe there was just a lack of creativity that went into how to adapt these newer shows for the movie format.
Yeah, that is possible. I mean, I think that like your classic kind of musical like Hello, Dolly, I could very much see that being a symptom of like the old dinosaur studio system in the late 60s. It's because of the subject matter and also because of the sheer size and spectacle of the thing. That wasn't... New Hollywood is all about doing things, smaller and more intimate and auteur driven. And that's just a big cast production, It's not a vision, it's a production.
Exactly. Was the infrastructure there anymore? As Hollywood was sort of pivoting to new models of new production models and new ways of doing things, suddenly the idea of putting on this lavish show, especially when, again, at the end of the 60s, there were a number of these big ones that were being made that were all kind of underperforming majorly after a number of their predecessors had done really well. I mean, they say that Hollywood trends are guided by what's making money. I think that if the audience was sort of turning, I really do think that it's astute to suggest that the audience was just kind of that Hollywood musicals represented an attitude of an age that was passing. I think.
Right.
I think rock and roll is probably tied to it too a little bit, right? I mean, the fact that people's relationship to popular music was changing too, and I think that obviously there are musicals that bring in a rock and roll spirit, but at the time it was it felt diametrically opposed almost. Were you into the Beatles, and if you were into the Beatles, were you also into a lavish Broadway show? I don't know.
And I think just in general, it used to be that musicals were a dominant cultural form. Like you were saying, your family listens to West Side Story. I think that was really common for a lot of families to get these records of the latest Broadway show and listen to it. And that in and of itself fell out of fashion. And maybe like what was kind of unique about Hamilton was that it revived that. Like I think a lot of people who were not into musicals got the Hamilton cast recording and listened to it. And that was like a throwback to sort of musicals being not just a little niche thing that only some people were interested, but a much more mainstream like cultural product.
Where would you put Rent in all of this? Because I feel like Rent is a case of a kind of cool musical that like cool people weren't ashamed to admit that they had seen.
Well, again, it's a thing where I think the musical comes at a point where it feels very, very revolutionary, but by the time they get around to making the movie, the cracks in Rent's facade had maybe started to show, and they make so many bizarre choices with that adaptation, including, casting the original actors when they're far too old, hiring Chris Columbus, of all people, to direct it, which is still one of the most bizarre choices that has ever been made. I think that Hollywood, it's sort of it's often missing the trends of what these musicals are doing, what makes them so innovative, because it's sort of adapting them so long after they come out and do something innovative, and they feel more old-fashioned by the time they make it to Hollywood.
Yeah.
One thing that I do think is important to note, too, is that I sort of feel like musicals dying down for a while in Hollywood was a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because when you basically were saying, when Hollywood studios were saying, we're moving away from this model, then what you had was a number of movie stars who were no longer, the idea, singing and dancing being a requirement of the job was no longer something that was as important, So if you wanted to make a musical, if you were somebody who was setting out to make a musical, you suddenly were faced with the fact that a lot of the younger talent in Hollywood were people who came up at a time when it was not necessary for them to be able to sing or dance, So I think in some ways, musicals going dormant for a while was partially a result of the fact that there just weren't that many big stars that could actually do what the classical musical needed them to do.
But didn't some of the classical movie stars also, like Natalie Wood singing was dubbed in West Side Story, wasn't it? They dubbed a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, no, there were definitely people who sort of who faked their way through the genre as well,
I mean, it's gotten to the point now where I'm like surprised when a movie star can sing. Like when I saw La La Land, I was like, wow, look at you guys, you can sing.
It is interesting how I think some people, you're so right that it used to be a selling point, right? Like Gene Kelly and this is what he does. But now it's like a hidden talent. Like Jake Gyllenhaal was recently on Broadway and Sunday in the Park with George, and he has like a gorgeous voice. Like not just, oh, this is good for an actor, like legitimately great. And it was like, what? How have we not been utilizing this for his entire career that he sort of had to keep this a secret talent? So yeah, put Jake Gyllenhaal in a movie musical, please.
Yeah, please. I would love to see that. I do think that the musical was sort of like the Western in a sense that, it did sort of, the popularity of it did wane a lot over the years. It never entirely went away. So we did get, we got musicals throughout the 70s, throughout the 80s, throughout the 90s. And it just survived kind of in other forms, and we would just get a lot less of them, in the same way that we get a lot less Westerns than we used to. There, obviously there was a time in Hollywood when both the Western and the musical were one of the primary forms of Hollywood entertainment, probably as big as superhero movies are today. But that just didn't happen for a few decades, but the tradition survived. And Caroline, you were saying, I think before we were recording, you were saying that you thought that the Disney Renaissance was part of the reason that the tradition survived.
Yeah, I really feel like as much as that was sort of my personal inroad to musical theater, I think it kind of was for culture in general. Like it's a big credit to Howard Ashman, who was the lyricist behind a lot of those early Renaissance movies, and along with Alan Menken had done Little Shop of Horrors on Broadway, which, Katie, that's another sort of semi-demented musical that might be of interest to you. But I think their work on the Disney Renaissance, it really, because they were movies for kids, I think people were willing to accept them as these big singing, dancing, cornier things. And so I think that kind of primed audiences to get used to the musical format. But I also think it became this sort of incubator for talent, and that you have somebody like Kenny Ortega. He directs my beloved movie Newsies, which was not well received at the time, has kind of been reclaimed as a cult classic. But he goes on to do the High School Musical series for Disney, and then the third one they put it in theaters. And I think that's another series that brings a lot of kids, like young people into the musical genre. And then
absolutely, yeah, like whole generation was raised on those, yeah.
Yeah, and then even more relevant to the big movie musicals, the Rob Marshall, who goes on to direct Chicago, which I think was a big turning point. He gets his start choreographing this 1997 TV movie version of Cinderella, which stars Brandy and Whitney Houston, was a big cultural sensation at the time. I
remember that one. It was so good.
Really, really charming, pretty revolutionary for how low key it was about the diversity of its cast in a really lovely way that I think holds up so well. So Rob Marshall choreographs that, and then he directs the little follow-up they did, which was a TV adaptation of Annie. That was his first directing credit. And then obviously he goes on to make Chicago. So I think that there is kind of a direct road through the Disney Renaissance, makes musicals popular. That puts something like Cinderella and Annie back on TV. And then that sort of gives Rob Marshall, the runway space to go on and make something like Chicago.
Can I just say, I had not seen Chicago until recently, and I watched it the other night, and I really liked it. I thought it was really good.
Oh, good. I feel like there's been kind of a weird, I don't know if it's a backlash, but sort of people being like, that was a little overrated. I feel like I hear that sentiment a lot, but I completely agree with you, Katie. I think I also rewatched it, and I think it's great. If anything, it is underrated in terms of how good and effective it is.
I mean, you want to talk about an edgy musical. I was just laughing at this version of Chicago where
people are getting murdered every other day.
On a daily basis. Some, no good guys getting gunned down in broad daylight on the street.
See, now it's been a minute since I've seen it, but I was not a fan when Chicago came out. Granted, at this point, that was now pretty close to 20 years. So maybe I'm due a revisit. But I remember being kind of surprised that Rob Marshall had made it, because he is somebody who has kind of a background in choreography. And I remember thinking that this was a movie, and I feel this way about a lot of Broadway adaptations, at least modern ones, in that this was a movie that sometimes seemed to be trying to, almost a little ashamed of the fact that it was a musical in some ways.
You mean how they keep cutting away to the theater and putting all the dance numbers within the context of that theater?
That's one part of it. I think that one part of it is that, and this is something that I think showed up in a few musicals of the early 2000s, which is that I get the sense that the movie is trying to give audiences permission to enjoy a musical by giving an explanation that we don't necessarily need for people singing and dancing. That's always been the buy-in with a musical, right? You have to accept that people break into song and dance. But Chicago sort of it sort of frames the various musical numbers as these kind of fantasy sequences. And beyond that, the way they're shot and edited, I think, is not in the classical sense of we are trying to give everyone the sort of the best view possible of the choreography. I think it's shot for a slightly more frenetic effect. But do you disagree?
At parts, it is kind of hard to tell what's going on in Chicago. I will agree with that there were parts where I was having trouble following the camera work.
I completely agree, Alex, with your description of the movie, but to me, I feel like all of those are pluses to me in the sense that I think musicals are a very theatrical form, and I don't think it's necessarily bad to embrace that about them. Like, I don't think every musical should follow the Chicago format of fantasy sequences, but to me, that works so thematically with what the movie's trying to do and with Roxy's story. And I kind of like the choice to find a way to embrace the theatricality rather than trying to make it just realistic in a way that I think can sometimes feel more alienating.
Yeah.
So I think I like those elements about it as opposed to finding them off-putting.
I felt it put it in its place in time because I felt like having all the musical numbers take place in this setting tied it to vaudeville and tied it to like jazz cabaret acts, which are, the time in which the film is set. So that's what I liked about it.
I'll say this too. I mean, I'm obviously am in the minority on Chicago, or at least among maybe the popular opinion of the film. I mean, the movie won Best Picture in 2002 and was an enormous success. And I would actually kind of look at it as one of two films that, in my eyes, sort of kicks off the modern age of the Hollywood musical. And the other film, I think, is Moulin Rouge.
Mm-hmm. Well, my memories of Moulin Rouge are from high school, and I remember I remember liking Moulin Rouge and liking it. I think the thing about musicals that can pull me in is the spectacle of it, and Moulin Rouge is very colorful and kinetic and dramatic and all and fantastic, as I recall. It's got a lot of fantasy elements to it. And, you were saying, Dowd, you got to buy in with a musical. But I actually don't mind if they go the extra mile of locating it within, like, a fantasy, like Chicago, or even just having sort of a magical realist tone like Moulin Rouge does. To me, that does make the whole thing a little bit easier to swallow. So I will say that.
I think one of the reasons that Moulin Rouge, for me anyway, sort of represents the genre's movement into a new era is that I think it does feel in its own way pretty modern. And it felt pretty modern in 2001 as well. Obviously, the film is a period piece. It's set in a much older time, but I feel like, for one thing, MTV was a partner in producing it, and it sort of, we had seen jukebox musicals before Moulin Rouge, but I feel like we had never seen one that felt so much like a movie kind of like reaching its hands into the pop culture and grabbing songs that people liked and mashing them together into this big mix-up, this sort of big mash-up spectacle. Caroline, are you a fan?
Oh yeah, I'm a big fan. I mean, it's just such a confidently weird movie. Like, it really, like that's kind of Baz Luhrmann's thing, is just the heightened absurdity of it, but I think done with such conviction. Like, this is a movie where I can just happily pull up any of the songs on YouTube on any, afternoon when I need a pick-me-up and listen to one of them. I think Chicago does the fantasy sequence in a much more like literal way in terms of, cutting between here's the real world and here's the fantasy. But I think Moulin Rouge actually does something similar. And you were kind of saying this, Katie, but there are almost like dream sequences within dream sequences where it's like, okay, Christian and Satine are singing here and now they're dancing on a rooftop in the clouds. And that's kind of a fantasy, but kind of real. And it really just goes all in a way that is slightly overwhelming, but I think mostly in a good way.
I'd say more than slightly.
Yeah.
I'm actually kind of exhausted by Moulin Rouge personally. I rewatched it recently. I've been kind of going through 2001 films this year. This summer we're going to be sort of looking back on 2001, as we do every year at the AV Club. We look back 20 years at the year in film. And I've been going through 2001. And I rewatched Moulin Rouge, and I found that my opinion on it hadn't changed much, which is that I think it has some spectacular sequences and some really moving numbers in it, and that the performances are committed in a way that I have to applaud. I mean, I think that both Nicole Kidman and Ewan McGregor are wonderful in the film, and their numbers together are wonderful. I find so much of the film very exhausting, though.
Yeah.
It has this kind of caffeinated late 90s energy that I do think was crucial to how popular it was. And in many ways, I mean, I think there's a connection between something like Moulin Rouge and something like Hamilton, which is that Moulin Rouge, I think, really was popular with a wide range of audiences. I think young people loved it.
It was of the moment in the same way that Hamilton was of the moment. They both managed to capture, like, the mood of the time, I think.
Yeah, very much so.
That sort of giddy pre-9/11 late 90s attitude.
And I think kind of Chicago does as well. Like, at least for me, I think in middle school when it came out, and that certainly, at least among my theater kid friend group, was a really big deal. And I think to some degree, I think it almost set the bar too high, like in that I'm not sure that a lot of the movie musical adaptations that have followed have been able to like recapture what it does, and sometimes they go too far into the fantasy device, which I think arguably Rob Marshall's 9 does, but then I think other times they don't go enough into some sort of device, as I think Rob Marshall's Into the Woods does. So yeah, I feel like to some degree Chicago, at least from what I'm looking for from a movie musical, I think Chicago did it so well that I'm not sure anything else has quite been able to recapture that, even though movie musicals have gone on to sort of have this at least somewhat of a revival since the Moulin Rouge Chicago sort of kickoff.
A lot of them are chasing that Chicago magic in a way,
Definitely.
Right? They're chasing that acclaim, and they are Hollywood has continued to look to Broadway and to look to major productions and say this can be a movie, and yet a lot of them have not succeeded in the way that their Broadway incarnations did. I remember when the musical version of The Producers, when they made that into a film, and that was such a big deal on stage. And then there was all these expectations on it. I remember reading, if you follow award season coverage, guilty as charged, I guess, and then I do that some years. But following that, everybody was like, Producers is the one to beat this year. And then the movie comes out, and it just it doesn't deliver for most people, And I think that something does sometimes get lost in translation from stage to screen.
Yeah.
For sure. And I think it is about, I actually think when you look at those older musicals from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, like they feel very stage bound in a way that I like, but it's like a different form of cinema, and that it's frequently like, we're going to lock off the camera and just show you a whole dance scene. And I don't know if audiences sort of want that same thing today. And so I think directors sometimes, and they're like, okay, well, we need to make it different, but they just don't know how to deliver enough of a heightened device to do that. And I think some of my sort of like the other ones I think are more successful of the sort of post-Chicago period. Like I think the Hairspray adaptation is pretty charming, and I'm a big fan of the Mamma Mia franchise. And I think both of those movies just kind of go in with the like, we're doing it, we're being corny, like gumption quality. And that does a lot to sort of just get you in the mindset of like, okay, this is the world we're in. And I don't know if they're quite as effective at it as Chicago is, but I think that I find those movies at least pretty charming.
One thing that you mentioned that I wish directors would do with dance sequences and with martial arts sequences, because the most impressive examples of both that I've ever seen on film were ones where it's just a static wide shot, and then you just get to watch the performers show off how skilled they are. And I wish they would do that more often in both of those genres.
Yeah, let us see the choreography. Let us see the dancing. I actually do think that's a problem with a lot of modern musicals. And I don't know if that's a situation where that's necessity being the mother of invention, or with their hands kind of being tied, in that some of the choreography just isn't there in the way it might have been in a different era, or if it's more what Caroline is talking about, which is that audiences now expect, when they go see a musical on the big screen, they expect it to be cinematic, and they expect to not be reminded necessarily of the stage roots of the material.
I mean, I would probably tend to think that it's a little more of the latter, simply because there's no way that there aren't talented dancers out there anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there are still very talented dancers out there working and talented singers. And there definitely are people that can do all, triple threats who can sing, dance, and act out there. And maybe it's just part of the quality of Hollywood being more risk averse now. In animated films also you see a move towards using celebrity voices instead of professional voice actors. And maybe they're casting celebrities in musicals instead of musical theater specialists who could pull off the kind of thing that we're talking about.
Well, that's a big part of it, I think. I mean, again, if you're talking about a different era of Hollywood, somebody could be both an enormous movie star and also be known as a song and dance person, And I just don't think we have that many people in the current day and age where, again, it's just not a qualification of the job anymore. You can be a huge star and not be able to dance at all or sing,
Yeah. Right. I guess my point is that it would require them to do slightly more risky casting to get, professional musical theater people to star in these musicals. And they don't want to do that. And so they cast an existing movie star, I guess is my point.
Yeah. I do think there are some people who kind of break through in a way that I think is great. I think both Amy Adams and James Marsden in Enchanted, those are like two of the best sort of musical theater Disney satire performances. Obviously, Hugh Jackman's somebody who has sort of done both Broadway stuff and
Cynthia
The
Erivo.
Greatest Showman. Yeah, Cynthia Erivo is a big one. I also will always stand up for Zac Efron, who got his start in the High School Musical movies and was in Hairspray and the unexpected juggernaut that was The Greatest Showman. And I think he's someone who has a little bit of that old school, old Hollywood charm. And, maybe he's not the best singer in the world, but I think he sings well, he dances well. I think he's somebody who I would love to see Hollywood build more musicals around.
Zac Efron was great in The Beach Bum, by the way. I don't know if you saw that.
Really great in it.
With the panini hair.
Yes, with the panini beard. Yes.
Yeah, whenever Zac Efron is sort of making fun of himself, I think that he has to either be super earnest or completely making fun of himself. Those are like the two modes that he operates best in.
Absolutely. And you know who else I love who does fit in that mode and is a good dancer is Channing Tatum. I think Channing Tatum's at his best when he's making fun of how good looking he is.
Yes.
So we've mentioned a couple of the ways that the musical has kind of survived in the 21st century because it has evolved. It's sort of it's adapted to adjust to changing tastes and changing sensibilities. I mean, we're still seeing a number of Broadway adaptations. We are seeing jukebox musicals, which have become, I feel like, more popular in the years since Moulin Rouge. Something like Mamma Mia was an enormous hit, and something like Rock of Ages was not.
That movie's so bad.
Sometimes I just have sense memory flashbacks to the fact that movie exists because I feel like most of the time I block it out and I'm like, oh God, that happened.
It's so terrible. I mean, I say this even as somebody who is an enormous Tom Cruise apologist.
Sure.
I find his relationship to his own stardom to be fascinating and almost always interesting on stage or on screen, and I can't stomach Rock of Ages.
Ooh, his sexy dancing in that is a lot. We'll put it that way.
So we've seen Disney has sort of kept the tradition alive as well with their own line of musicals. And the other thing that we've seen is musician biopics. And I feel like they have filled the space that musicals maybe once would have filled. We've seen a lot more of those over the last couple decades, even after Walk Hard so ruthlessly and accurately parodied them. How do you, I have to ask this. How do you make a musician biopic after Walk Hard?
It's remarkable how early that came out in the trend. Like, I was kind of looking up some dates of this. I was like, oh, that must have come out after they had made, a dozen of these. It really came out just after they did Ray and Walk the Line. And it is crazy that then they just continued to make them after that movie.
And continued indulging in the same cliches that movie was, again, so effectively spoofing, I mean, like, I sometimes will watch something like Bohemian Rhapsody, which I thought was really honestly just dreadful. And that film indulges in all of these cliches that were called out, like more than a decade earlier by Walk Hard. I guess maybe if Walk Hard had actually been a hit, there would be some sort of actual aftershocks of that, I suppose.
Reckoning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, as a rule, I'm not the biggest fan of the musical biopic genre. I always, the sort of pedantic side of me always bristles when they would sort of get in the musical or comedy category at the Golden Globes. And I'm like, these are really just dramas that have, on-stage performances. These are not using the music to tell the emotional story in the way an actual musical would. One I would stand up a little bit for, though, is Rocketman, which I think, the Elton John movie, which I think towed the line well between, or at its best, towed the line well between being the sort of, we're doing the concert, Bohemian Rhapsody style, but then also sometimes we're taking the musical numbers into sort of fantasy full-on musical sequences. I think some of the staging in that, not all of it, but some of it is really cool in terms of the way they use choreography to sort of transition from one location to another. There's a scene where Elton overdoses, and it kind of becomes the sequence where they take him to the hospital and then they dress him for a concert and they push him out on stage, and it's all sort of flows in a really interesting mix of choreography and cinematography. And the whole movie isn't like that. Like, a lot of the movie is kind of corny and bad, but I think the best parts of that movie actually would be an interesting path for other movie musicals to try to emulate.
Because that one, you think actually that one you could call a musical and you would feel comfortable with it.
Yeah, it's as close as I would feel comfortable with. I mean, again, this is just me. You have something like Jersey Boys, which is a Broadway musical in and of itself, so you can't quite say that's not a musical. But yeah, I always do, I don't know, bristle a little bit about, I guess I feel protective of musicals. So when I feel like other things are coming in to take them over, I want to stand up for the form, the purity of the form.
And then, of course, we should mention the one place where musicals never went out of style, and I don't think ever will, which is in Bollywood, in the Bollywood film industry. Pretty much every movie, I think for bang for buck, you can't get any better than a Bollywood movie. They're always 3.5 hours long. They have romance, they have action, they have comedy, they have musical, they have everything you could want in a movie.
I have to admit, I'm not as familiar with Bollywood as I wish I was, but I will really stand up for the sort of lightly Bollywood-inspired movie Bride and Prejudice, which is an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, directed by Benedict Beckham's Gurinder Chadha, that I think is just a super fun, sort of very campy, modern-day movie musical, a little under the radar. So, yeah, I really enjoyed that one.
So that one is a full-on musical?
Yeah, there's some great little musical numbers in it. There's a song called No Life Without Wife, where the sisters are sort of making fun of, the patriarchy, basically. And it's very enjoyable.
I dig. Because, there's also movies that aren't musicals but kind of play that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. It's almost like I sort of think of like the spirit of the musical has sort of survived even in non-musical form in Hollywood, and has just sort of I sort of think of it like dinosaurs turning into birds, like we have I think we have films that are at their heart musicals but don't actually qualify as part of the genre. I remember when reading your review of Crazy Rich Asians, Caroline, that you noted how much that movie feels like a musical in spirit and aesthetics, but it's not actually one, right?
Yeah, I actually think, it's interesting in the romantic comedy genre, how many of those films will just sort of have an inexplicable music sequence. Like, I think of something like 13 Going on 30. They're just like, okay, now we're all going to dance to Thriller for a scene. Or in My Best Friend's Wedding, they, have like a musical number at a table. Yep. And I think Crazy Rich Asians, in addition to sort of feeling like a musical throughout, they sort of have this wedding sequence that it comes as close to feeling like a musical as a non-musical can.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that really there is a connection between rom-coms, sort of the glossy studio rom-coms, and that sort of old-fashioned Hollywood musical.
Yeah, and of course, the director of Crazy Rich Asians, John Chu, he also directed In the Heights.
Yeah, yep. I was pretty pleased when he was announced. I was like, yeah, I had the sense he would go on to make an actual musical one day.
It's nice to see him do a bona fide musical because he's been kind of dabbling in that form his whole career. I mean, he's made concert films as well, or sort of tour diary films, and he also directed a number of the Step Up movies. And I'm a big fan of that series, and I think partially it's something that we talked about earlier in the episode, which is that those are movies that are not afraid to give you a nice long look at the choreography, at people just dancing. They will essentially just set up the camera around the perimeter of a dance floor and just give you a long look at it. And they feel like a musical in the sense that they're often built around the set pieces. And those movies are often just about how can we get from one ecstatic moment of song and dance to the next.
And less so the first Magic Mike, but Magic Mike XXL plays like a musical too, because they play all of the strip numbers all the way through.
Right.
And you get to see some of those from a distance too. You just watch the whole thing as if you're sitting in a theater watching it.
It is interesting that as the sort of conventional musical went away in the 70s and 80s, there was that rise of dance movies where it was like Footloose and Dirty Dancing and Flashdance, and that did sort of become somehow that, like, dance movies, even as people were turned off by the corniness of movie musicals, somehow dance movies still had a little more of that coolness factor. Another one I really enjoy is Center Stage, which is a ballet movie from the year 2000. So yeah, you have Center Stage, you have things like Save the Last Dance. I think that those sort of, they're also very like woman-led. I think that both musicals and maybe some of these dance movies, or something like Bring It On, which is like half dance, half sports movie, it's a space for women in movies that maybe you aren't getting in other genres.
Yeah, that's something that I do want to address, like, I mean, I'm sure that me being like, I don't know, man, musicals aren't for me. I'm sure there's an element of internalized misogyny going on there where I'm like, oh no, that's, it's something that you have to learn to unravel throughout your whole life. But like, for a long time I was like, oh no, you have this, you want to set yourself in opposition to, quote unquote girly things because those are dumb. And it's taken me, like, a lot of my adult life to make my way back to romantic comedies and maybe now even musicals,
Yeah. It's interesting to me because, I mean, I completely agree with you, Katie, that work is sort of never ending of unpacking all that stuff. But I have to say, to me, watching a musical number, it, like, hits the same parts of my brain as watching, like, a big fight in an Avengers movie. Like,
yes.
To me, sort of heightened worlds, they can all kind of fall under the same umbrella. And some are heightened in the song and dance way, and some are heightened in Cap's picking up Thor's hammer way, but they're sort of they're equally goofy. It's just one tends to be a little bit more coded in like the masculine direction and one in the feminine direction. Yeah. But I think that sort of heightened worlds, if you think of them more just, under the umbrella of heightened worlds, maybe that's a way for people to find them a little more accessible.
Oh, absolutely. And I was being very intentional when I brought up martial arts movies earlier, because martial arts sequences in movies, I think, function in a very similar way to dance sequences in movies. And action movies are equally about choreography.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you have the same problem that we're talking about in a lot of movie musicals where it feels like they're kind of edited to death. I feel like you see a lot of that, and certainly in superhero movies. I always feel like watching the behind-the-scenes stuff on like a Marvel movie, I'm like, wait, these actors are doing so much and they look great. Why does none of that read in the final product?
Totally.
And it's the same thing if you watch the behind-the-scenes of a movie musical, and you're like, oh, this choreography is so much more interesting than it came across when it was sort of all edited to death.
Yeah, I mean, it's about appreciation on some level, isn't it? I mean, like when you watch a musical or a martial arts film, part of it, you're going into it in hopes of seeing somebody who is very, very good at what they do. And I find myself, when I'm trying to sell musicals to cinephiles who otherwise don't necessarily get into them, I say that there's just so much craft involved in putting them together, in the great ones anyway. And that craft extends from behind the camera to in front of it, I mean, you are seeing people who are at the top of their game sometimes perform, and also in terms of how the films are staged, you're often seeing an enormous amount. It takes an enormous amount of talent to put together a coherent and satisfying musical number.
Yeah. Personally, I'm really into artifice, and I'm really into heightened worlds, like you were talking about, Caroline. And so, like, that's what when I watch, a musical, that's the stuff that I really like. And coincidentally, I thought In the Heights did that very well because John M. Chu made it, maybe.
Yeah. Well, and that's something like, you know, Les Mis or Cats. I feel like at some point on this we have to mention Cats. Like, they make these bizarre choices where it's like, well, let's be realistic and grounded. And it's like, is that what we want? I mean, I guess that kind of, I can see the logic of Les Mis, but is realistic and grounded and gritty what we want from a Cats musical?
No,
Like,
that's what Andrea Arnold movies are for.
Yeah, exactly.
That I will say too, and I always take an opportunity to dunk on this movie. Any opportunity I can take to dunk on this movie, let me have it. The Lion King remake. The quasi live action Lion King remake. To me, the fundamental flaw of that film, again a musical, is that it has this misguided notion that we would somehow want a realistic version of that story. That we would want one that subscribes to zoological realism and also realism of physics. And I just don't understand why that ever was an approach that you would want to take to the Lion King, you know?
Well, especially then when it's like, and let's keep the songs. So it's like, what are we doing here? Let's make this a photorealistic lion, but it's still gonna sing "I Just Can't Wait to Be King." Like, what is the thought behind that? It is interesting. I think that the live action Disney remakes, like Beauty and the Beast, and maybe to a lesser degree Aladdin, but probably Aladdin too, like, I don't really find any of those movies that good. I think they suffer from not having the most talented performers in them, or even when they do have talented performers, they'll really like overproduce their voices in a way that I think takes away. But I do think that the recent slate of Disney animated movies have continued to do a really good job of using the musical format. So things like Tangled, my beloved Tangled. I think Moana is the best of those recent ones, and the Frozen movies, obviously, which were so popular. I think that those... Again, I think animation allows people to sort of, it allows the creators to sort of embrace the corniness and the full range of emotion of a musical in a way that maybe people feel more embarrassed about when it's live action.
Interesting. Well, you know, speaking of stylization and heightened realities, you know, I'm thinking about like one of my favorite directors who kind of specializes in that kind of thing is Quentin Tarantino, who, you know, is all about artifice and spectacle. Only, you know, it's framed in a more traditionally masculine way. And, you know, but music is a big driving force in his movies too. And in, you know, in a lot of movies, like Edgar Wright's movies are very needle drop heavy. And those films, you know, if you really want to take like a long range galaxy view of it, they have musical elements too, because they are driven by these pop songs. It's just the characters aren't moving their mouths and singing along.
Yeah, I think it's
completely.
I think it's the spirit of the medium living on in a new form in a way, you know? I don't think anybody would classify something like Pulp Fiction as a musical, but there are scenes in it that flirt with it almost. I mean, the Jackrabbit
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood comes close, though. There are parts of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood where it's practically a musical.
And Baby Driver is a jukebox musical, almost, I would say. It's very close to it because, honestly, it so much of it is driven. I mean, that's one where the car is basically filling in for the dancers, you know. We're basically seeing a car move to music in a way that, for me at least, is highly reminiscent of the form of a musical.
I think that Spike Lee is finally actually doing like a full-fledged movie musical, but he's another person who I'm like, every one of your movies is like a third of it is a musical.
Yep.
Like, I don't know, you know, it feels like I've never seen a Spike Lee movie where there wasn't sort of a dance break or a musical number. And it's like, really, you love this format so much. And so I'm glad he's doing a full-on movie musical. And I would honestly love to see more from him. I feel like that would be a great genre for him to work in.
Yeah, I'd love to see that too.
I feel like there's a number of filmmakers who, if they were given the opportunity, if we lived in an era where musicals were valued in that way, that more of them might approach it. I mean, I'm also very excited, honestly, about Steven Spielberg's upcoming West Side Story. Again, I love West Side Story. I love the movie they made of it in the 60s, so I don't necessarily think we need another version. But the idea of Steven Spielberg finally making a musical is really exciting because, again, I think some of the best musicals are interesting on both sides of the camera, and he is somebody who I think has the talent to orchestrate a big musical sequence in a way that maybe we wouldn't recognize, that would look new to us.
Yeah, between that, In the Heights, and then the Dear Evan Hansen movie that's coming out in September, I feel like we are sort of in a big year for musicals again, and I'm curious if this will inspire more or if we'll sort of, people will have a fill their fill with those three big movies coming out.
Do you see this as sort of the dawning of a new era of musicals, or kind of a culmination of something that's been building, like since those High School Musicals movies that you were talking about? Because, I think more in that kind of like Disney, kids, young adult space, musicals have been a dominant force for a while.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess things are sort of generational, right? And it's like a certain generation will come of age and embrace these things more. And I think a lot of it will just come down to how well those movies are received. Like, I think we've had sort of big movie musicals in the past, like something like Les Mis, where it feels like, well, will this be a turning point? And usually they're pretty financially successful, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it's pushes us into a new era. But I think that any of the movies that are coming out this year, rather, have the potential to be that. And yeah, I mean, and not to be like, ooh, and what are the kids doing on TikTok? But I do feel like that's a form that is friendly to musicals. And maybe that implies that younger generations are sort of more embracing that form again. And that will propel a lot of these movies to be more popular.
No, TikTok is made for dance trends and lip syncing videos, and there's tons of that stuff on there.
And making Ratatouille musicals in quarantine. And
right. And, we mentioned High School Musical, but like those same people, or maybe not those people, they're even younger, but like, millennials grew up also with Glee and with the Pitch Perfect movies, and all that stuff is kind of in the same general realm.
Yeah, it did kind of carry over into the TV side. In addition to Glee, there was Smash, which was a fascinating cultural experience in its own right. Something like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, which I think does so many interesting things with the musical format. So it does kind of hop back and forth now between the movie side and the TV side, and I think both sort of influencing each other, in addition to all the stage stuff influencing both.
The impression I get is that the musical will never fully die, even if we go through another period where it passes more out of vogue than it is now. Because I think that at the risk of sounding corny, and we're talking about we've been talking about the corniness of musicals, I think there is an innate desire in audiences to get a little song in their heart, That's about as corny as I could put it, I guess. But I do think that one of the trends we're identifying over the last 40 years is that we have seen movies that have essentially been musicals in a different form. And when I thought about this when you were talking about the fact that movies like Footloose and Flashdance were big in the 80s. And to me, that felt like filmmakers found a way to give audiences permission to love a musical again. That the traditional musical felt outdated to a lot of people, to a lot of viewers, and they just found a way to kind of disguise the feeling that those movies give us, and just put it in a new package. And I think we're going to keep seeing that. I think sometimes we'll see maybe sort of a winkingly retro or ironic framework put around them, and sometimes I think it'll be sincere. It'll just be sincerely old-fashioned and touch people's nostalgia centers in a way. But I think that we're going to keep finding. Filmmakers are going to keep finding ways to repackage musicals for audiences who think that they're over that kind of spectacle.
And it does kind of fit into whatever the culture is at the moment. I think, in the 50s, there was a real embrace of earnestness, and that really tied in well with musicals. And maybe in the 70s and 80s, that maybe cynicism was a little more in vogue. And then in the early 2000s, which is, as we're talking about, is like the turning point, that was just like excess was in vogue. I feel like, Moulin Rouge, part of the reason it felt like a movie of the moment was because it's like, let's put sparkles on everything, and let's put every song you've ever heard, and let's turn everything up to 11. And maybe we are, who's to say what the next cultural trend will be, but maybe it is a little bit more back towards earnestness and a little bit more of that wholesomeness. So maybe this will kind of be the kickoff of a new wave of those, more overtly earnest musicals.
Everyone says the Roaring 20s are coming.
True. So Chicago is really primed to come back in fashion.
Yeah.
Okay, so Katie, favorite musical of the 21st century?
I think my favorite is one that I also recall from, this late 90s, early 2000s period that I was really taken with then, and I still enjoy to this day, which is Hedwig and the Angry Inch. I think that musical captures the spirit of another musical that I just unabashedly enjoy for a lot of reasons, which is the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I think those two, that they're kind of in the same general bucket of like the they're rock and roll musicals. They're like tongue-in-cheek, kitschy. They're queer. I just find them both really exciting, and I like the music in Hedwig also.
Caroline, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I said before that I think Chicago was the pinnacle of the modern musical, so I'll take a moment to stand up for my beloved Mamma Mia, particularly the first one, which I think is actually better than the sequel. I don't know how much of a hot take that is, but I think the Mamma Mia movies do just a nice job of embracing the inherent ridiculousness of musicals and not being embarrassed by it, and finding the joy in it, and in a weird way finding moments for like real humanism and emotion too. Like I think in being so ridiculous, they can then be like, and now we're going to have this incredibly moving mother-daughter scene, and they kind of weave it in so well that you're like, oh, why am I crying? Like, what was happening? I was watching a ridiculous ABBA musical. So I will always stand up for the Mamma Mia franchise.
I will say those films benefit from having a catalog of absolutely terrific pop songs to rely on,
Yeah, some of the catchiest songs ever recorded, I would say.
Exactly. I think for me, it's La La Land. And I know that film has its detractors, and there's I think plenty to dislike about it, honestly. But I think in what that's trying to do in terms of squaring a kind of old-fashioned musical romanticism with the sort of harder realities of trying to make your life's dreams come true. I've always appreciated the melancholy that creates. Those two things create in that film. I think the ending of that movie is up there with the ending of An American in Paris in terms of just expressing everything that the characters are feeling purely in spectacle and in song and dance. And that movie to me feels like a descendant, and it's very, very much by design, of course, but I think that movie is a descendant of the melancholy musicals of Jacques Demy, and I appreciated it bringing that into the 21st century.
I think that musical does a really nice job of getting around that problem of how do we get audiences to embrace like this heightened world. Like I think just what it does with color and visuals, really you're like, okay, everything's jewel toned, and that is setting a thought in my mind that this is not fully realistic. Like I think that movie strikes a really nice balance there, and is an original movie musical, which maybe that, given also the at least commercial success of The Greatest Showman, maybe that's an area Hollywood could start exploring, further stuff that's original, not just Broadway adaptations.
Exactly, conceiving these things directly for the screen, where you're not doing the awkward business of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
That's all we've got for you this week on Film Club. You can check out In the Heights in theaters or on HBO Max now. Thank you one more time to our guest today, Caroline Siede. You can check out her When Romance Met comedy column next week on the AV Club, and then every other Friday. You can also check out her movie podcast, Roll Calling, wherever you get your podcasts. While you're at it, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was produced and edited by Carl Blomberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Zach Goldsboro, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. Check back next week when we'll have a brand new episode. We'll be talking about Pixar. Thanks, folks.